Today we want to continue our series, and we want to get into two of the lesser known of the English Bibles, and maybe of slightly lesser importance. When we talk about that, we talk about really in the history of the English Bible, the three stars of the show are Tyndale, the Geneva Bible, and then the King James. And there are these other three or four that kind of fill in between, and they make some notable contributions along the way. And they also advance. Everything advances towards like building blocks to the creation of the King James Bible in 1611, and we'll talk about that when we get to it in a couple of weeks. But today we want to look at two that are very closely related. That one almost causes the other never to be done, and also and we also have the first authorized Bibles in the English language, and those two are the Matthew Bible and the Great Bible. Matthew, or the Matthew's Bible, is produced in 1537. It is actually completed by a man named John Rogers, who we're going to take a look at. John Rogers was an associate of Tyndale, like Miles Coverdale was, and really in that early era of English Bibles, Tyndale, Miles Coverdale, John Rogers are kind of the triumvirate of Bible translators. Daniel affirms, of course, that Tyndale is the most competent and the most learned of the translators, mainly because his facility in working with the English language. He was a much better English scholar than the other two. Also, Tyndale was a better Hebrew scholar. In fact, he was the only one of the three who really had facility in Hebrew. Coverdale obviously didn't. We looked at that last week. And neither did John Rogers particularly. He wasn't completely illiterate in Hebrew, but he was not he was not competent enough in the language to translate. He could read it, he could make sense out of it, but it wasn't, in terms of a nuanced translation, that wasn't John Rogers' strength. Rogers produces the Matthew's Bible, and he uses the name Matthews to hide his identity. And it was not hiding his identity. It wasn't that nobody knew John Rogers was involved in this project. It was a little bit of subterfuge, and it was and as we'll look at it, it was a way for this version to be used without invoking the name of William Tyndale, who still was a hot button item for Henry VIII, and all of this is going on during the time of Henry VIII. After Tyndale is strangled and executed, which is October 6th, 1536. And between that time and then the creation of the Matthew Bible, Tyndale had translated a significant portion of the Old Testament. The question is, what happened to his notes? His notes had been seized. His house in England had been raided, actually illegally, to seize his papers. And probably what happens, we don't really know for sure, but what seems to have happened is that Tyndale's translation, which went from Joshua to 2 Chronicles, his notes escaped with John Rogers. John Rogers then sets about the work to complete the Bible, to make a complete translation. Now, Coverdale's already exists, and then Matthew gets involved in it, and works also. But again, our friend Miles Coverdale is also involved in the Matthew Bible project to the extent that it is Coverdale's translations of large parts of the Old Testament, which he did mainly from Luther's German Bible and the Latin Vulgate and a couple of other translation. Rogers pulls it all together and is creating a copy, a new English version of the Bible. And he completes that in 1537. Now, the name of it, and it appeared in limited form at that, only several copies were printed originally, and it was entitled The Bible, which is all the Holy Scripture, in which are contained the Old and New Testament, truly and purely translated into English by Thomas Matthew. Now, Thomas Matthew, again, was the pen name, if you will. And Matthew and Rogers is going to be an important individual there in that regard. And remember now, Henry's on the throne, and those two men we talked about last week are now his closest advisors. You have Cranmer, Archbishop Cranmer, who wants a English Bible. And he has Thomas Cromwell, who is the king's first minister, who is very sympathetic towards that goal. Cranmer is the one who's really pushing this. And Rogers' Bible, or the Matthew Bible, comes to his desk. It is given to him. Now, everyone knows that Tyndale's work is the main component of the Matthew Bible. Rogers is well known. It is a literary device that is often used by ancient writers in that era, ancient writers in the medieval period, to hide their identity. In other words, to get published, to not have any taint, because John Rogers is so closely associated with William Tyndale. Had he put the Bible, Old and New Testament, is translated into English by John Rogers using William Tyndale's notes, it would have gone nowhere. There is no way Henry VIII would have been able to sign off on that and allow it to be published. So it was going nowhere. So it's a subterfuge. And again, like I said, this isn't uncommon. Benjamin Franklin, when he was a teenager, was trying to get published, and he created a female persona. You maybe have heard of this. He wrote under the name Silence Dogood. He adopted a persona of a middle-aged widow living in Boston or living in Philadelphia, and began to write letters to his brother's newspaper, and they were published under the name Silence Dogood, although it was Benjamin Franklin who was doing that. Thomas Matthew is a fictional character. He's a pen name, but it allows, in terms of appearances, everybody to say, let's use this, because Rogers' name isn't on it. He did fear a little bit of persecution, but it was more to get around the fact that he was so closely associated with Tyndale. Cranmer writes Thomas Cromwell, asking him to use his influence with the king to permit and to quote for this Matthew Bible, this new version, this Matthew Bible by Thomas Matthew, permitting it, quote, to be sold and read of every person without danger of any act, proclamation, or ordinance heretofore granted to the contrary, until such time that we, the bishops, shall set forth a better translation, which I think will not be till a day after Cranmer is working, pushing the archbishop, pushing the bishops under him to create an English Bible. The bishops are dragging their feet. The project that Cranmer refers to is the Great Bible. Henry wanted an English translation. He had allowed Cranmer to get it started. It was going absolutely nowhere. And so Cromwell goes to Henry VIII with this recommendation, and Henry approves it. So Matthew's Bible was the first English Bible to have royal approval. A little bit more than Coverdale. Remember, the first edition of Coverdale was it was allowed, but Henry didn't sign anything. It was kind of verbal agreement. However, in this royal license, which was a written approval by the king, it was approved not only for Matthew's Bible, but also the second edition, or the 1537 edition of Coverdale, which bears on its title page, set forth with the king's most gracious license. So in 1537, you have two approved Bibles. You have two Bibles in English being printed, being distributed freely, without, as it says, without any danger of act, proclamation, or ordinance heretofore granted to the contrary. And this is an important statement by Henry. By Henry granting this license is making the statement that he's in charge of the church. There was not an appeal by the Archbishop to the Pope. There wasn't an appeal by the Archbishop to any other authority. There was an appeal to Henry. And Henry grants this license for these two Bibles to be out there. So it's interesting. 16, 17, 18 months after Tyndale dies, and is reported to have said as he was being executed, "May the Lord open the eyes of the King of England." By 1537, the eyes of the King of England, Henry VIII, had been opened, or at least Henry understood that having a Bible in English advanced his purposes. And so Matthew's Bible was the first approved, licensed, authorized, if you will, version of the Bible to be read in the churches, to be used in the churches, to be available, to be printed. You could go to the print shop now and procure a copy of the Bible in English without any penalty of law to follow you. Now, John Rogers hits the pinnacle at that moment when he does his New Testament, or when he does the Bible. He did leave the country for a while and went to Antwerp. He returns to England during the reign of Edward. And when Mary comes to the throne, John Rogers is martyred. Now he dies in 1555 in the famous Smithfield massacres that Mary perpetrated upon. Calls together a large group of Protestant ministers with the idea of talking and discussing. It was a trap. They were taken. They were executed. John Rogers is occasionally mentioned as being the first martyr under Mary, and that's incorrect. He was a martyr. He certainly was not the first Protestant martyr under Mary's persecution. There's really no way of knowing who was the first person under Mary to have been executed. But John Rogers was important. He continued. And so of the triumvirate, we talked about this last time, of the triumvirate of Tyndale, Coverdale, and Rogers, Tyndale and Rogers are executed. They are killed for their work in translating the Bible into English. Now Rogers was executed just because Mary was trying to get rid of all of the Protestant ministers. She was trying to impose Catholicism back on the country. And again, Rogers was not well connected. Like Coverdale. Again, we talked about that last time. Coverdale survives. Coverdale, remember, is arrested at the same time Rogers is. And but because of Coverdale's brother being the chaplain of the King of Denmark, there is an intercession by the King of Denmark to Mary. And Mary has no desire to go to war. And to reject the request of the King of Denmark for one person to be released or to be allowed to go into exile, it could very well have turned into a war that Mary simply could not fight. Denmark had a powerful navy. Denmark was a powerful country at that time, and England again would not expand its navy, would not expand militarily to empire status until Elizabeth. Mary apparently decided it was expedient to let Coverdale go into exile as opposed to having him executed and risking war on the continent with Denmark. So, and again, Denmark was a very Lutheran country. All the Scandinavian countries, northern Germany, the Scandinavian countries had embraced the Lutheran Reformation. Lutheranism was rapidly becoming the state religion in many of those Scandinavian countries, and Catholic influence in the Scandinavian countries was minimal at best, and it was eroding rapidly. So the Matthew's Bible comes out in 1537. It is probably in terms of collecting, it's the most difficult Bible to obtain. There just aren't a lot of them, because both the Coverdale Bible and the Matthew's Bible would be supplanted because the bishops finally get going. And in 1539, the Great Bible is produced. Now, the Great Bible is the Bible that Henry VIII wanted. The Great Bible is probably not the same project that Cranmer is referring to. That the bishops wouldn't get something done until the day after Doomsday. The Great Bible was a renewed effort to create a Bible. Not for the people. Whereas Coverdale's Bible and Rogers' Bible or Matthew's Bible was for individuals. It was a nice size, a family could own this. The Great Bible was not designed for that. The Great Bible was designed for churches. It was Cromwell directed the clergy to provide one book of the Bible of the largest volume in English, and the same set up in some convenient place within the said church that ye have care of, whereas your parishioners may commodiously resort to the same and read it. And so Cromwell's plan was a New English translation, a large volume in large print that would be in each of the churches, of which there were nearly 2,000 at this time. that there would be one there. The church would have it, so all the people who could read but who could not afford to buy a Bible, a Matthews or a Coverdale Bible of their own, would be able to go and conveniently read the Bible. So that was Cromwell's plan, and it was again our friend Miles Coverdale who comes to coordinate and bring it all together. And Coverdale works on the Great Bible, and it is placed. It is worked on for several years, but the Great Bible it's really the Tyndale Bible, with some of the more objectionable language kind of mollified a little bit, and some of the things that Henry particularly didn't like, it was adjusted. But again, and also remember, English is still dynamic at this time. It is late Middle English that we have with Tyndale. Several years later, it's moving. It is beginning to change, and so there's a little bit of updating that had to be done as well. This Bible, the Great Bible, is also occasionally referred to as the Cromwell Bible. You'll see that reference once in a while. It is occasionally referred to as the Cranmer Bible, because in the second edition of the Great Bible, there's a preface by Cranmer. Now, it's fascinating because in subsequent printings, remember when Cranmer falls from favor, when Cromwell and Cranmer fall from favor, Cromwell, a picture of his device, his coat of arms, is actually etched out of subsequent editions of the Great Bible when he fell out of favor. They didn't redo the title page. They just kind of etched out, and it's funny. I'll show you a copy of it in a couple of weeks when we do this class upstairs. We look at all these individual Bibles. I'll show you the place where Cromwell's insignia has just been etched out. It's the same block printing technique. It's just that he's been obliterated. It is also known as the White Church Bible because that's after the printer. It's also probably most famously known as the Chained Bible. Now, the idea of the Chained Bible, it's not entire. It is. The word the Chained Bible is sometimes referred to in a negative sense. In other words, the connotation is that the Bible, the Chained Bible, was chained to the platform, chained to it, so the people couldn't get to it. Well, which is kind of the opposite of what was really meant. The Chained Bible was chained to the location where as Cromwell ordered, it be commodiously placed so it could be read, but it was chained to it so someone couldn't basically pick it up and steal it. It was not the chained is not a negative. It was chained, it was placed, but that wasn't to keep people from having access to it. It was to keep people from stealing it. This is the Great Bible is a large Bible. It's basically the largest. Most printings were the largest book that could be successfully or easily printed and bound, and they weren't inexpensive. A Bible, even a Matthews or a Coverdale Bible, to go and order one, you're talking about the upper middle class and nobility in terms of the socioeconomic scale. The middle, the lower middle class, and obviously those who are in the lower classes economically, simply can't afford 3 or 4 pounds to pay for a whole copy of a Bible for themselves. You're talking about the equivalent of a worker. You're talking about several months of wages, and most people simply could not afford that. And so the Great Bible was designed for all of those people. It was designed, and the project was commended, again by Cromwell, so that people who wanted to read the Bible, who were literate, but couldn't get one on their own, could go somewhere and commodiously, as he says, I like that word, commodious, to go and read it and have access to it. The chain simply being the security of it to a public place, was just to keep it from being stolen. Just like, it was really no different. If you've been to English churches, the way it would work, the sanctuary would be open. The doors of it would very rarely be locked. Someone could come in at any time and they could pray. They could be there, and if the Bible was up in the front on a podium, they could go and they could open and they could read it. The doors wouldn't often be locked, but the chain was there, so someone couldn't pick it up and walk out the door with it. The same as the church would lock away during the week the communion vessels, which were often silver, which were often, rather valuable. A communion service, if it was either a silver tankard that you would pour the wine into, or the silver plates that the bread would be distributed by. These were valuable items. They would no more leave. You couldn't chain the communion devices anywhere to keep them from being stolen. You lock them up, and the vicar would lock them up in his house and bring them out on Sundays when they were needed. The Bible was meant to be there, and it was just chained for security. That's really all there was to it. But the Great Bible then was largely Tyndale. Coverdale translated the Old Testament and the Apocrypha again from the Latin and German translations. Again, he wasn't a Hebrew scholar. His Greek was okay, but not great, so he followed after Tyndale. And it was put together. Henry was exacerbated almost daily by the bishops. His bishops were simply slow. Henry moved very fast and was very impatient by nature, and he understood scholarship. He understood the work it took to translate. Remember, we talked about Henry several weeks ago, and we talked about, Henry was a scholar. Henry was, he was the Renaissance in one person. He wrote music, he wrote books, he had written the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. He understood what scholarship and what translation, he understood the time it took to do it correctly. But he also understood that his bishops were showing no signs of actually getting their work done. He was so he had allowed, one of the reasons he allowed Matthew Bible to have license, and the second edition of the Coverdale also was because of that. The Great Bible was finally then completed. It was a lot of work to get done. It is again great because it is large. It is roughly 14 by 9 inches. It is, which is the largest of the Bibles to date. The title page is contains a long description of Henry VIII. There's a large picture of him on the title page. He is dominant. He is more dominant on the title page than God. He's more dominant than the apostles. He is viewed as, again, the defender of the church. And there is a, like a word balloon associated with him where he's repeating Acts 13:22, like as rain and snow, so the word also that cometh out of my mouth shall not turn again void, but shall accomplish my will and prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. So notice the change from the biblical text to the pronouns. This is, Henry is giving the people a Bible. Henry is giving a Bible to the English language. He's getting the credit for it, and that's just the way things work. It would be the same under the King James. James is going to get a lot of credit, whereas Henry and Elizabeth, who would follow him, were significant scholars in their own right. James, not so much. James was much more interested in. James would produce the book of sport. He would talk about the things, all the exceptions. Whereas Elizabeth and Henry talk about the things you were not supposed to do. James would talk about all the things you could do on the Sabbath and not technically break the Sabbath at the same time. The first edition of the Great Bible was about 2,500 copies. They were printed in Paris, actually. There were some adventures with it because some of them, the early copies, were seized by the French because they were viewed as heresy. Finally, they started being printed in England. It went through 6 printings between 1540 and 1541. The second edition, which had a significant revision, was in 1540 and also includes the preface by Thomas Cranmer, who commends the reading of Scripture. Interestingly enough, Cranmer's introduction in the Great Bible will also appear in the Bishop's Bible, that we will mention next time when we talk about the Great Bible, when we talk about the Bishop's Bible, and we also talk about the Geneva Bible, and those two and how they fit into the overall scheme. Now, Henry. Now we're talking about the end of Henry's life, towards 1539. We're getting towards the end of his life, and the Great Bible has unintended consequences, and his freedom allowing Bibles, Coverdale and Matthews, to be printed freely and sold freely without any danger of any act or proclamation. To the contrary, it soon became apparent that the Bible was the most popular book in England, with some ramifications that Henry did not like. He was upset that phrases in the Bible, which have been translated into English, were turning up and becoming the basis of popular songs of the day. Sort of like, if you remember the 60s, there was a song by the Byrds, a very popular song called "Turn, Turn, Turn," which was it's Ecclesiastes. To every day there's a season. There's a day for this, a day for that, and it was the Byrds took Ecclesiastes, made a popular song out of it, and this drove Henry crazy. Henry was, for all of his faults, a very pious individual. He had a high regard for Scripture in sort of a mystical kind of sense. In other words, he really didn't like the idea that the Bible was being used, words and phrases from the Bible were being used in popular songs that people were just creating and singing. And as a result, he began to put restrictions on the ability of the Bible to be available to people. And by the end of his reign, he had decreed that the Bible could only be read in church, owned by upper-class families, and all marginal notations were to be blacked out. So, someone had to go around with a marker, black out the marginal notations. Shortly before his death, he also outlawed the use of any Bible except the Great Bible. This and then Mary's persecution that will last a few years. This makes the number of copies of Matthew and Coverdale scarce, because they start being destroyed. And by the end of his reign, obviously about 3 years before the end of his reign, Matthew and Coverdale had ceased to allow to be printed. And so there were fewer copies of those. That's why Coverdale is exceptionally difficult to get very hard to find. Matthew's very hard to find good, solid copies of those. They're not impossible, but they can also, run into the tens of thousands of dollars. Great Bible, little bit easier to find. They remained approved. Even Mary really didn't destroy them. It was the English Bible is too far out of the horse was out of the barn, as it were, too far, and she knew she couldn't just destroy all of the Bibles. They weren't printed anymore under Mary, obviously, and under Edward, they were produced rapidly and in great quantity, and also the Geneva was becoming more important by that time as well. We'll talk about next week. But it is interesting because Henry, again, is viewed as, in a negative sense, he puts restrictions on the Bible. He was, you couldn't read it. And what he was trying to do in his own oddly pious way was to honor the Scripture and to keep it from being debased in his mind in this popular sort of way. And in that time, it was, the way for him to handle that was not to let people except the best people, the upper class, the educated, the pious people like him. They were the ones who were allowed to have it and to read it, etc., and go on from there. It's very similar. You can draw the analogy, if you will, perhaps of the Civil War era, the era right before the Civil War, America, 1800 to 1865, and in the South, it was illegal to teach black folks how to read. It was very, the way to keep them under control was to not allow them to even learn how to read. some notable exceptions, Frederick Douglass being one of the notable exceptions there, who got to the north and became a great. I mean, it was interesting as a sidelight. I mean, there were people in the South who were convinced that Frederick Douglass must not really be black, because he could write, because of his facility at the language and his ability to write and think. Well, it must be something's wrong, because black people obviously can't. They're not capable. And so that was how the Southern whites tried to control things. The same way Henry did. He tried to control the piety, if you will, and the respect for the scripture by restricting it, keeping it out of the hands of the lower class, who would take this and debase it in his mind. So it's remember, society in that area is very class structured. The people on the top were better. They viewed themselves not only as better, we might say today that someone who is wealthy is better off. In that era, people who were wealthy and people born into the nobility were not better off, they were better. And so there was a difference there, and a very, very class-oriented, very, very interesting way of looking at society. But again, that's kind of to sort of rescue Henry a little bit for some of the bad press he gets. I think it's important to understand that he did put restrictions on the Bible towards the end of his life. But he had reasons for doing that, and it wasn't oppressive in terms of religion. He wasn't trying to, repress religion. He was trying to save it. He was trying to keep Christianity and the proclamation of the scriptures pure, as he saw it, by restricting who could really be involved with it. So 2 important Bibles: Matthew's, which is really John Rogers, and the Great Bible. Matthew's Bible is the first approved Bible. It has a royal license. The Great Bible is the first authorized Bible. It is authorized, it is commanded to be used in the churches. And again, our old friend, one of the triumvirate, Miles Coverdale, is involved with Tyndale. He's involved in the Coverdale Bible. He's involved with Matthew's. He's involved with the Great Bible. And again, to a lesser extent, we'll see next week, he has his hand in the Geneva Bible. So Coverdale stays alive, unlike Tyndale and John Rogers, who are both executed at different times for different reasons. But Coverdale remains very, very important in the process. Questions? Yes, sir.
The first edition of the Great Bible, how many copies did you say was printed?
First edition of the Great Bible, 2,500 copies.
500, okay.
And
You said it was first printed in France, and then
it was printed in Paris. And then then slowly they began to move the print. Paris had all the printing apparatus. England finally does catch up with that, and they're able to produce large quantities of high quality printing.